in the meantime, I want you to enjoy the coming discussion with Ronnie Cummins, who is, like Michael Shaw, one of the great heroes, I think, in our struggle to make the country, go back to its principles of freedom that really need to be reinvigorated and remembered, and the fake education system is making sure everyone forgets. Ronnie Cummins is the National Director of the Organic Consumers Association, and in particular right now that's very relevant with the fight to try to keep GMOs from taking over the world and America in particular. So I'll tell you more about that later, but our time's short. Let's jump into the discussion with Ronnie Cummins and pay attention. This is another good one. Okay, so hey everybody, this is Richard Sachs broadcasting for Lost Arts Radio, and we're incredibly fortunate finally to be together with Ronnie Cummins, the National Director and the co-founder and international director of the Organic Consumers Association, as well as its Mexican affiliate. And this is a really good time to be having a discussion because there's a lot going on with GMOs and environmental and agricultural concerns in general in this country and all over the world. So we got a lot to talk about. Thank you for being here, Ronnie. It's really nice to be with you.
Good to be with you.
I thought before we get into the big deal with the bill that's before the House right now that they may vote on this week, maybe tomorrow, I would be interested in hearing how you ended up, if you were starting the Organic Consumers Association, what led up to that, why did you do it, and what are the main things that they do at this point?
Sure. Well, I've been an activist ever since the 1960s when I got involved in the civil rights movement and the anti-war movement. Mm-hmm. And, in the late 1960s, a lot of us realized how screwed up the food and farming system was in the U.S. So we moved back to the land, a lot of us, and started growing organic food, or others of us who lived in cities or towns started food co-ops and, started this whole alternative food farming movement that has grown quite large. And from the 60s to the early 90s, I was involved in all different aspects of activism, everything from human rights work in Central America to anti-nuclear work and so on. But starting in about 1992, I realized that we had a huge potential to get people organized through food and farming and health, environmental issues. And so I became the campaign director for the Foundation on Economic Trends in Washington, D.C., the Pure Food Campaign. And one of the things we worked on were organics and organic standards and fighting against the new genetically engineered foods that were just starting to come on the market in the early 90s. 1994 was the first one. And we realized that, here we had millions of people buying organic food in the U.S., but we didn't have a national organization representing the views and the aspirations of organic consumers and small organic farmers. So 16 years ago, I co-founded Organic Consumers Association, and ever since then we've been promoting organic food and farming, and also exposing how industrial agriculture is not only hazardous to our health and the environment, but, cruel to animals, bad to small farmers. And as we started learning about a decade ago, chemical-intensive, energy-intensive industrial agriculture and factory farms are actually a leading cause of global warming. So if we're going to solve all these problems of global warming and rural poverty and deteriorating public health, damage to the environment, we're going to have to connect the dots and build a mighty movement. And so that's been what I've been working on the last 16 years, more or less.
Okay, all right. Yeah, we have a lot of background in common. Did you ever hear of somebody named Alan Chadwick? He was a
yes,
student.
I think I have.
Student of Rudolf Steiner, and he came to America and ended up at UC Santa Cruz in California. And when I was a university student in the mid-1960s, I became his student, and aside from the massive just memorization of the academic stuff, I actually had him as a real teacher to introduce me to the whole organic farming and gardening idea long before USDA thought about using it for their purposes. So I can really identify with a lot of what you're saying. And at this point, now that you've created this organization, what are some of the things that they mostly focus on? And then let's move into this major bill that's happening right now.
Sure. Well, from the beginning, we've served as a monitor and a sort of policeman for organic standards and also fair trade standards. We think it's very important that if we're going to have standards, that they're enforced properly, and that if we realize standards aren't good enough, we should be able to raise those standards. So fighting for organic integrity and organic standards, along with groups like the Cornucopia Institute, has been and continues to be an important part of what we do. Same thing for fair trade. I mean, basically, we believe that, the organic food and farming system, has got to be sensitive to issues of economic justice, that we can't have, immigrant farm workers being exploited while we're, producing organic crops and foods and so on. So we believe that across the board, justice is an important part of sustainability and health, and that we need a marketplace where consumers demand fairness throughout the supply chain, as well as purity and healthy system. So we've worked on the standards for fair trade and organic, but we've also, from the beginning, tried to educate as many people as possible, working with our allies far and wide, to expose the dangers of industrial food and farming and the sort of out-of-control chemical industry out there, and point out to people that their concern about pesticides and antibiotics and growth hormones and GMOs is justified, and that we need to vote with our dollars in the marketplace and try to change public policy wherever possible, even though it sometimes seems a losing battle to fight with the Congress and the White House on the federal level, because they seem to listen more to their financial contributors than they do to their constituents. But nonetheless, we've fought hard for the past 2 decades, using a variety of tactics, all the way from suing companies to boycotts in the marketplace to grassroots lobbying of politicians and regulators, and coalition building. And so I think we're in a pretty good position now, in the sense that the alternative media has grown up to be massive, and we have hundreds and hundreds of groups that are more or less cooperating together on a daily basis to educate and mobilize the people. So even though the mass media is controlled by corporate special interests, we've built up over time our own mass media, which is the internet and Facebook and alternative radio and newspapers.
Right. So, I really agree with what you said about voting with your dollars, which is the whole free market idea that avoids dictatorial control. And I think what makes that challenging right now is when you have government operating with unlimited fake money printed by a, mostly foreign-owned central bank that can get as much money for whatever they want to do as possible, and then they support the industries that encourage poison food production. And I'm really interested in solutions to that, because I think the fact that they have unlimited money to print on their side. You know, for example, the USDA, even though they started the organic program, I find it really hard to consider them very trustable since they're about the biggest promoter of GMOs on the planet. And I guess it takes incredible creativity to figure out, with that money advantage that they have, how to not let them poison everybody, basically.
Yeah, I think we certainly were opposed to the idea of the USDA controlling or having a great deal to do with organic standards ever since the late 1990s. But we lost that battle. Federal organic standards did come into being the law. And so we've seen the need to make sure that the standards are as high as possible, and fighting the USDA whenever we've found it necessary, which is pretty much all the time. But one thing over the last 20 years is what we've noticed is that the clout of consumers and small farmers and conscious citizens in the marketplace has increased considerably. Whereas campaigns that I organized against, say, McDonald's in the early 90s only had limited impact, even when we managed to, build nationwide campaigns. Nowadays it's different. These big food companies are operating under tighter profit margins right now. And basically, after 20 years of hard work and education and so on, consumers are now moving away from the junk food and beverages slowly but surely. And this is eating away at the bottom line of these multinational billion-dollar corporations. So even Coca-Cola is, and the rest of them, Pepsi, Nestle, they're all really alarmed at this point about this notion of consumers knowing whether they have genetically engineered ingredients in them. They're very concerned that consumers are starting to ask questions about pesticide residues and animal drug residues, and they're in a panic, basically, and they appear willing to completely shut down the last vestiges of democracy, if need be, in order to keep concealing the fact that the products they're pushing out on the public are literally poison and have, set off the worst, human health crisis in modern history.
Yeah, that's a good description. And I think one of their best camouflages from the part of the public that still doesn't really realize what they're doing is that I don't think normal people can imagine that somebody would knowingly sell poisonous food. I mean, that's just a concept above.
I know it's pretty diabolical. We see what the tobacco industry did and still continues to do. And the more you look at the food industry and you look at their public relations operatives and the labs and the scientists they buy off and so on, it's really no different. I mean, right now, big food companies in the United States have this unholy alliance with big pharma, the big banks, and the big government, and they are hell-bent on maintaining their profits no matter what the situation. I mean, a lot of them don't eat their own products, you can bet that. They're dining on organic food in fine restaurants, but they are quite seemingly quite content to keep poisoning the people, even though the health indexes on all sides show that we're approaching disaster. And of course, the industrial factory farming production system, the so-called free trade globalized system that they're pushing, has pushed the living earth right to the breakdown point. And so we don't really have any choice anymore but to move away from this degenerate system, is the only way to describe it, of food and farming and politics and marketing, if we're going to survive.
Yeah, absolutely. Before we get into the what I'd like to do is a little bit of history about the labeling movement and where it is now. I want to make a comment and a question on what you mentioned about the battle that was lost to independently control organic standards, and the government, the USDA became the overseeing authority. The fact that they are that now, but of course I'm sure their strategy, if they can and when they can, is to dilute the standards. But in spite of the fact that they have that control now, what are the possibilities as a private for-profit business to start a truly independent certification agency that would get big and ultimately take over? Do you think that could ever be done?
Well, I think there's some areas of the National Organic Program standards, that are pretty good. When you look at crop, production, vegetables and fruits and so on, the standards and the certification are basically very similar to the same kind of certification that we did at the state level or independently before. But when you look at something like, say, the meat and animal products sector, you look at organic eggs, for example, or organic poultry, most of the production in the United States for chicken and eggs labeled organic is being carried out in these factory farms. They might be they are feeding the animals for the most part only organic feed, which is better than feeding them the chemical GMO feed. But it has nothing to do with the organic ideal and what people think organic means. So a group of us have decided that in these areas where organic standards are definitely failing us, one of them is beef production, another is the egg and chicken and dairy production, that we are in the process right now of creating new standards. For example, the fastest growing sector of the food market right now in the U.S. is not organic food, it's grass-fed beef. And the reason for that is that consumers are becoming aware that grass-fed and grass-finished beef is much better for your health, A. B, the animals are not confined in feedlots or factory farms. They're roaming out on the range the way they should be. C, the ranchers get a better price for their products typically if they're producing grass-fed. And that if you look at the environmental impact of factory farm feedlots and compare that to the proper planned rotational grazing of animals on grass like they're meant to be, it's actually beneficial to the environment if you do grazing right. Whereas feedlots are 100% disastrous. So in an area where we can't get, I'm frankly tired of begging the National Organic Program to change. I'm willing to keep pressuring them, as is our base of consumers. But in a case where we have to have higher standards, what we're doing is working with producers, retailers, wholesalers, processors, certification bodies to create standards that go beyond, organic. And one of those areas is grass-fed, grass-finished beef and meat, and another is the what we call regenerative poultry production. There's some other areas where we tried to raise the standards over the last decade around body care products, because a lot of companies were calling their body care products organic when in fact they weren't. And we had some success suing companies, embarrassing the USDA, embarrassing the industry. We made some headway, but we're still not, we still don't have standards for things like body care products and nutritional supplements that are transparent and truthful and clear. So we're going to have to keep fighting on all fronts. And where USDA organic standards are still useful, Well, yeah. I mean, we don't need to reinvent the wheel there. But where they're not useful, we do need to create new standards and go forward. Of course, if you're buying locally, from a farmer or a producer, you don't really need certification in the same way you do if you're buying out in the marketplace from a producer that you don't know. So we encourage people, first and foremost, to deal with your local farmers and ranchers and producers and artisans and so on. People you can look in the eye, people you can go to their farm or go to their workshop and see what they're doing. There's no reason why those people have to be certified. The certification is based on, personal contact in that. But for those selling into the marketplace, I think it is valuable to have a level playing field, if you will, and we need to enforce those. If the government won't enforce them, like right now, we're having luck with class action lawsuits against companies that are labeling their products as natural, when the products are filled with GMOs and synthetic chemicals. So we use every tool at our disposal: class action lawsuits, boycotts, shaming the companies, challenges at at shareholder meetings and whatever. But the bottom line is that we need a truthful marketplace that, is filled with products that are good for your health, good for the health of the planet, and where the producers are paid a fair price for doing things right.
Yeah. And how is it, you mentioned that you're still trying to keep the standards as good as possible within the USDA program. How exactly do you do that? Or if you see a place they need to be improved, how can you try to have an influence so that might get done?
Well, when the USDA, when Congress, they passed the Organic Food Production Act in 1990, saying that we needed to have federal organic standards. And it took them 12 years until 2002 to actually publish the final standards. In the meantime, they tried to get industry, tried to get them to say that it'd be fine to use GMOs, it'd be fine to use sewage sludge, it'd be fine to use irradiation. And we managed to fight those off. And so the 2002 standards didn't allow GMOs or sludge or irradiation or anything other than a few biological pesticides. And so we've been able to keep GMOs and those other biggies out. And then but when they set up the law, they knew that they had to be somewhat responsive to the organic community in the way that standards were maintained and changed over time. So they set up a thing called the National Organic Standards Board, which is the only board at the federal level of government that has some statutory power exercised by civilians, that is, people who aren't in the government or the regulatory agencies. And so we still have a little bit of clout in the 15-member National Organic Standards Board. They can't pack it with just industry hacks completely. So we've got we don't have a majority anymore, but we've got a healthy minority of people who have real integrity on the National Organic Standards Board. So you can't really change things too much without going through them. The second thing is that we have these National Organic Standards Board meetings a couple of times a year, and OCA has done everything from protests and picket lines to, I think last year at one of them, we actually had to commit civil disobedience and get arrested to call attention to outrageous actions on the part of companies trying to lower standards. So we, petitions, education, media work, mobilization of farmers and consumers, we have been able to hold our own in most cases. But there are some problems. with organic standards that are structural, I would say that we're going to have to go outside of the National Organic Program to solve those. I mean, one thing is that when we were setting standards over the decades in the organic community, we didn't understand things like climate change. We really didn't. We didn't understand that there's a difference between climate-friendly food and farming and climate-unfriendly food and farming. We didn't really know that it's not enough for an animal to be fed organic feed. How that animal is treated on a day-to-day basis really impacts the environment. And if you want to preserve the environment and biodiversity, it has to be integrated with real organic grazing practices, not just for cattle and other herbivores, but chickens as well. I mean, free-range chickens can have a really beneficial impact on the environment if you do it the traditional way. Whereas you coop them up in a building, even if you're feeding them organic food, you're having a really different impact. So some of these things we didn't know. I don't think we understood that an herbivore that's grass-fed and grass-finished, that is, that doesn't get any grain at all, that the meat that comes out is much, much, much healthier for you than grain-fed beef in this case. And we didn't know some of this as well 10 years ago as we know now, but now we know it, and it's our obligation to turn this, $40 billion, industry into, the best we can do. And of course, we've got this so-called natural food industry that's just as big as organic, but it's basically a greenwash. So consumers are spending over 10 cents of their consumer dollar right now, their food dollars, on organic or natural foods. The problem is that many of these foods labeled natural they're just chemical foods, disguised, greenwashed.
Yeah, I mean, natural has no definition, right? Legally, anyway.
Yep, no definition. And so at this point, the only tool we've got is we're exposing these companies, and then class action lawyers are suing them. So we're seeing more and more companies take the term natural off their label because they know that they're subject to possibly being sued. And we've tried to really educate the public. So you see something called natural, instead of making you feel good, it should put you on alert that if this thing were really natural, it'd probably be organic. And look at the ingredients, and you can tell right away whether it's natural or not. And 90% of the time, it's not.
I would like to get a little bit into the GMO issue right now and talk about why that's a big step up from just normal poison through agricultural chemicals, and then how that led to the labeling movement, and just a brief kind of rundown of from where it started to where it is now.
Yeah, well, I mean, genetic engineering and the toxic chemicals that always accompany genetic engineering in food and crop production are a big issue, because from the beginning, 20 years ago, when they first forced these products on the market with no real independent safety testing, and they made sure they wouldn't be labeled, from the day one, the American public was skeptical of genetic engineering. When they heard that, well, yeah, you can mix the DNA, genetic material from any living thing and put it in any other living thing, and you can get a patent on it, they thought, well, I'm not sure I like that idea. So from the beginning, it's interesting. You've had, and this goes back to the early 90s, you've always had surveys where around 40 to 50% of the public, they actually think that the genetically engineered foods are unsafe. which is true. They are unsafe. But you also had a considerable number of people who just weren't sure whether they were safe or not. But they wanted labels and they wanted independent safety testing because they were alarmed by this technology. And, so 80% of the public either think GMOs are unsafe or they're not sure whether they're safe or not, but they darn sure want to know what it is they're eating. So this has posed a major, major problem for the big food companies and the chemical companies and the genetic engineering companies like Monsanto or Dow or DuPont or BASF or Bayer or Syngenta, because they know, as they learned in Europe, that if you cave into public pressure to label these products, that the grocery stores won't sell them, restaurants won't serve them up, and farmers won't grow them. That's the reason today in the European Union, which is the largest agricultural market in the world, you don't really find GMOs on the shelves for the most part, and you see very little in the way of GMO crops being grown. It's not because there's a ban on them. You couldn't really ban them given the World Trade Organization rules and regulations. But just by requiring labeling and by requiring a semblance of independent safety testing, Europe is essentially, there's a de facto ban. So they were determined in the United States and Canada that they were never going to allow labeling. And so they came up with this totally bogus scientific justification for that. They said, well, look, genetically engineered foods are substantially equivalent to non-genetically engineered foods, and therefore we don't have to have any independent safety testing. We don't have to have any labeling. And they fought tooth and nail for the last 21 years now, to make sure there was no labeling. But meanwhile, consumers never really, instead of being bombarded by the mass media, especially the last few years, with scientists paid for, scientists saying, oh, these products are safe, the most heavily studied food products in history, and, there's no evidence they're unsafe, and they're not bad for the environment, and so on and so forth. It's interesting that the polls still are the same as they were back in 1994. The public still do not believe that genetically engineered foods are safe. And the same proportion of the public who wanted labeling way back then still want labeling. I mean, there was a poll yesterday in Virginia, and, 84% of people in Virginia said they want labeling. Now, this is in spite of the, $100 million advertising and propaganda barrage over the last few years. But the only people, really, when you look out there, who oppose labeling and oppose safety testing are scientists, who are on the payroll of big food or big chemical companies, the elite in the corporate media who depend upon advertising revenues from these big food companies and big pharma companies, are elected public officials, especially at the federal and state level, who are basically bought off by big chemical, big food, or big ag, big pharma interests. So the public has a healthy degree, thank goodness, of common sense. And not only that, the majority of the public are now getting their news, at least in part, from the alternative media. And so industry has failed completely to convince the public that GMOs and the toxic pesticides that accompany them and the animal drugs used on the animals in factory farms that are fed GMO grains, and the growth hormones that to make them grow faster and so on are safe. The public does not believe that. And if they could afford it, 60% of the public say they prefer organic food. You know, and the only reason why they're not exclusively purchasing organic food, if you ask them in these surveys and focus groups, is they say, well, you know, we can barely afford our food budget right now. If we pay more for organic, we know it's worth more, but how are we going to pay our, you know, our rent and our medical bills and, you know, our kids' tuition and everything else? So even though Americans are spending less on food than they did in the 1950s, where we used to spend 22% of household income on food, nowadays it's under 10. The thing is, people are paying so much for other things that they feel like they can't afford to always pay the premium for the best food. But they know organic is better, and this is a big problem for the big food and junk food companies, because they're starting to lose the allegiance of the public. The millennials, the younger folks, are not going to McDonald's like they used to. They're not drinking Coca-Cola like they used to. The general public aren't falling for the scam of, you know, aspartame, you know, diet sodas actually helping you lose weight. It turns out they actually make you gain weight. So they're in a big dilemma now, and they cannot afford for the public to know the hidden ingredients in their food, because the entire food system, industrial food system, would collapse. And so they're desperate, and they're reverting to desperate means like these so-called free trade treaties that they write in back rooms that actually take away the rights of states and localities and even national governments to test food, to test chemicals, to label food ingredients and so on. I mean, we just saw in the World Trade Organization basically just told the United States that you can't require country of origin labels on food products anymore. And if you don't take those country of origin labels off, especially beef, we're going to slap you with hundreds of millions of dollars in fines. And, you know, the House of Representatives just repealed country of origin labeling. I mean, the Senate hasn't repealed it yet, but no doubt they will.
You know, isn't it amazing that I don't think the public has fully realized the caliber of people that make up the majority of the so-called representatives, and they would do something like voluntarily join this kind of authority to override U.S. law?
No. I mean, the polls have always shown that when you, if you ask someone, do you support free trade? Yeah, I mean, maybe they'd say they do. But when you explain that free trade actually means these corporate-controlled international trade agreements that basically are dictated by the biggest corporations, well, no, they don't support that. You know, they don't support exporting U.S. jobs overseas, you know, and all the other ramifications. But the thing is, people are just, they're so bogged down in everyday life with their health problems, or they're, you know, they're burnt out from their job or getting to and from their job, and the problems in the family, the problems in the communities, the psychological and physical problems that come from eating junk food, that they can't. The body politic is so sick that it's hard for them to respond to things like stolen elections and orchestrated terrorist attacks and and constant surveillance. That we're in a real crisis, and of course it's not just the USA. Most countries in the world, the body politic are, essentially good people at the core who would like to do the right thing, but they just are stumbling through life and are now manipulated by these international elites who have tremendous skill at confusing people, tremendous skill at addicting people to their products, and are willing to go to any means necessary to stomp out dissent once people rise up.
And so one way that they can do that is to make sure that people aren't physically healthy enough to think clearly, right?
That's right. And, of course, it's very profitable for Big Pharma to have a sick population, and then you got doctors who are, basically forced, if they don't willingly do it, to do things like inject dangerous vaccines into people and prescribe dangerous drugs to people when, 80-90% of the medical problems in the country could be solved with a healthy diet, with the proper exercise, with stress reduction, and, basically a meaningful life. If people had meaningful jobs that they believed in, that were socially beneficial, well, they wouldn't be so screwed up when they got off work at the end of the day to where they have to, pop the pills or, or overindulge in alcohol in order to just survive.
So there's a few deeper issues that we need to take care of, like having people not spend their entire lives on a job that they hate, right? Which is what most people are trained for now.
It is. It's amazing that now the system has got it to where young people, they're programmed in school to not really think for themselves, but to adjust to an authoritarian corporate environment in order to get ahead. And then by the time they get out of school, most of them are in debt, $20,000, $30,000, $40,000. And so they don't have any choice but to go to work for the man in the corporations. And the next thing they know, they've got kids, they've got obligations, and they don't know what to do. And then they end up on the pharmaceutical treadmill or the alcohol treadmill. And, it's very difficult for people to escape from that once they're entrapped in it. But more and more people are waking up, partly because we've built up this alternative media and alternative, information source, and things like natural health. Even though the government and Big Pharma are working overtime to stamp out natural health, more and more people are waking up every day to the fact that we can take back control of our health if we'll pay attention to what we're eating and exercise and, get off those pharmaceutical drugs. And,
Yeah, I think this is what we talk about every week. So it's really neat that you guys have come through your own path to a lot of this, exactly the same conclusions. And on your argument about labeling being a de facto ban, that it's not that you don't want a ban, it's that voluntarily handing over authority to an association like the World Trade Organization makes even an obviously necessary ban temporarily impossible. And the next best thing would be if we can put as close as possible to a poison warning on the foods that are actually poisonous. That would change the market. And so we've come through that system, of progression up to the point where states are almost succeeding in some cases, like California and Oregon, with the help of your group and Dr. Mercola and Dr. Bronner's and a few others, almost able to put these labels on the food. But Monsanto and all their friends at grocery manufacturers, which is a big promoter of GMOs, and other groups like that are spending just enough money to let the good guys put in all of theirs and not win. And now, in addition to fighting us off that way, there's something that they're trying to do to preempt the whole fight at the national level. So maybe you could explain to people what that is.
Yeah, there's a bill in the U.S. Congress right now. It's probably going to be passed tomorrow in the House of Representatives. That basically it's called it's called by our side the DARK Act, Deny Americans the Right to Know. The Pompeo bill basically says that we need to, they don't come out right out and say this, but there's the 10th Amendment to the Constitution basically talks about a balance of power between the federal government and states. And we have a long-standing tradition that where there aren't federal laws applicable, that states and localities have the right to pass their own laws.
Right.
And we've been operating like this in terms of food safety and food labels for over 100 years.
Well, actually, I don't want to lose your train of thought, but I want to interject here that as far as I can tell, if they actually upheld their oath to follow, obey, and defend the Constitution, the government's not even allowed to be involved in agriculture, as far as I can tell, at the federal level.
That's right. That's right. I mean, you got these hypocrites in Congress. I mean, some of the hypocrites call themselves Democrats, and they claim to be in favor of consumer rights and, food safety and, all this stuff. And yet tomorrow, most Democrats in the House of Representatives are going to vote for this DARK Act, right, that takes away the right of states to require mandatory labeling of genetically engineered food. On the other hand, some of these hypocrites call themselves Republicans, and they claim that they support individual liberty, that they support free markets, that they support states' rights, that they support a balance of power between the federal government, and state and local governments. Well, what's going to happen tomorrow in the House of Representatives is that most of these so-called most of these Republicans, these so-called hypocrites on states' rights, are going to vote for the DARK Act. When you look behind the scenes, you understand why, because these people are getting significant money from big ag, big pharma, big banks, big energy companies, who are all one big happy family in terms of pushing an industrial agriculture system on the public. So we have got to, and it doesn't matter, like I guarantee you that the Virginia members of the House of Representatives tomorrow, they're going to vote for the DARK Act, right? Well, there was a poll in today's newspapers in Virginia showing that 84% of Virginians, despite this barrage of propaganda, won't labeling. Okay, well, they're all going to ignore this tomorrow. Right. So it just shows that we've reached a crisis here. The reason they're doing this, they would prefer not to do this because it exposes them so terribly, in the public eye. But the reason why Congress is going to go to the length to basically abolish states' rights in regard to, labeling GMOs and abolish consumer rights and go against 80 or 90% of the population is because the big food companies, we have defeated them in the sense that the body politic, the hearts and minds of the public are now facing another direction. They want organic, they want healthy, and they want the big food companies to stop poisoning them. So the only move left for big food, big ag, big biotech is to eliminate states' rights. And I think, they're going to be surprised starting tomorrow to see just how angry they've made, 50, 100 million people across the U.S. And it's not going to be as easy to get this through the U.S. Senate as it has been so far to ram it through the House Agriculture Committee and now the House floor. There's going to be a ferocious battle in the next 2 months, and they'll probably realize that, we may not win the vote in the Senate, so I guess we better have a secret rider attached to appropriation bill. Come when the government runs out of money at the end of the fiscal year, September 30th, they're going to have a continuing appropriations, or else they'll shut down the government. And I think that's the point at which we'll see the Dark Act attached as a rider. And then the Democrats and Obama will be able to say, well, we really didn't have any choice, we were going to have to shut down the government, and, we don't agree, blah, blah, blah. So,
well, and they can say that all these organic extremists are trying to shut down the government.
Yeah.
Right. Conspiracy theorists.
But one thing people have to realize right now is that they're doing this because we have the upper hand now in terms of public awareness and the way people are spending their dollars and what they're cooking at home and so on. Slowly but surely, things are changing, and these margins for these big food companies, which are pretty small, are now in danger. I mean, Coke is losing money in the United States now on its Coca-Cola beverages. Pepsi's not making money on their junk beverages. They're making money off things like bottled water, their acquisitions of organic and natural products. They're making money still off, the developing world. They're not making money anymore with the average American consumer and the average American young person. So they're doing this out of desperation. So no matter what happens in Congress, the bottom line is that if the government won't allow us to label, is that we're going to have to expose these foods ourselves in the marketplace and damage the bottom line of these companies so severely that they will have to back off. And we can do this through careful laboratory testing of these toxic ingredients and utilization of the spaces in the alternative media to mount major assaults on these companies' images, bottom lines, and so on. And whether they like it or not, just like this year, you see Coca-Cola is taking aspartame out of their products. Pepsi's taking aspartame out of their products. Why? Because the public has become aware of the fact that these so-called diet sodas are just poison, and they make you fatter. And so these companies who for 20 years have been telling us, oh yeah, these artificial sweeteners, they're safe. The FDA said they're safe. They're taking them out, just like the trans fats and a lot of the artificial flavors and colorings. They're taking these out because they hope that the public will not keep on demanding, you know what, we don't just want artificial flavors and colors out, we want trans fats out. We want you to get rid of the pesticides, the antibiotics, the growth hormones, the GMOs. We want food that is like the way food used to be 50 or 60 years ago, when everything was organic, when conventional meant organic. Nowadays they talk about conventional food. Well, conventional food just means chemical food.
Exactly.
And I mean, look around you at the health of the population, and you'll see this is a massive attack on our health and our rights. At this point.
So listen, let's say that the labeling campaign at some level, even if it had to be, alternative approaches, if they get this national label, restriction passed, let's say that somehow this is successful and we get them to stop selling GMOs successfully, then we've got this contamination pretty much worldwide from GMO pollen, even in the remote mountains of Mexico and stuff like that. What's the status right now on ways that could eventually be cleaned up?
Well, once you start banning GMOs and the toxic chemicals that accompany them, you do see a reduction. Like, for example, there's some studies recently where a family gets their urine tested. A family that doesn't buy organic food, right? So they get their urine samples and they're filled with pesticide residues, right? And so then they, as part of the experiment, they start eating only organic food. And then very quickly, the pesticide residues in the urine, in the blood, go away, right? Well, it's a little bit similar in the environment, that we're never going to get some of these GMOs out, the trace levels of contamination, but we can start to reduce, these levels in the environment. And it's possible to get this under control if we will move now. And I think what we're discovering is it's not just the genetically engineered organisms that we have to worry about. It's been from the beginning the chemicals that accompany them. I mean, this latest blockbuster study by Dr. Shiva from India, who's an MIT scientist, he's finding that, one of the things that it does when you genetically engineer soybeans is that it causes the soybean plant, to be unable to regulate and dispose of formaldehyde, which is, formaldehyde's not just a probable carcinogen, it's a real cancer-causing carcinogen. No one disagrees with that. Well, we haven't been testing formaldehyde levels, in soybeans and soybean-derived foods. I guarantee you, this is going to start to happen now. And once the news comes out that, we tested, McDonald's hamburger buns, we tested the hamburger meat, we tested the French fries, we tested the cooking oil, we tested the milk and the dairy products, and here's the list of toxic chemicals that we found in them at levels that cause major, major damage to human health. It's like, that's what we're going to have to do. If the government won't test, if the government won't allow us to label, we, the people, are going to have to take things in hand. Now, why do I think the public are going to be willing to do this? Partly because they have pushed us beyond the point of no return. I mean, this DARK Act is going to be the straw that breaks the camel's back. When the public see, it doesn't matter if 80 or 90% of us want something, Big Food now controls the federal government 100%. They're going to be mad, and so it's our job as campaigners to channel this anger in a direction where we can actually change, things in the marketplace. I mean, people, you can't obviously, you can't just sit back and think people are going to solve your health problem and your diet problem. I mean, the fact of the matter is Americans eat way too much processed food, and even processed organic food is not good for you, I mean, overly processed. We have got to get back in the kitchens. We got to get back and learn those recipes like our grandparents knew. We've got to renew our cooking skills. We've got to simplify our diets. We've got to stop wasting food, and then we'll find that, all of us can afford organic food if we learn how to garden, learn how to grow sprouts in our house, stop wasting money on crap, consumer crap, and make those investments where they really count, which is healthy food for yourself and your family.
Well, one thing that ties right into being able to do that is that, and this is true even if we got rid of GMOs tomorrow, which would be fine with me, there's a little detail that a lot of the anti-GMO groups overlook, I think, and that is that the only way this is going to be useful is if we get thousands of new, small, truly organic family farms to start immediately to fill the gap when we get rid of the poison food. So,
yeah, and we can do that. I remember, it was the year before I was born, in 1945, but in 1945, Americans grew 50% of their food in backyard gardens, school gardens, parks, and so on. Over across the ocean in Great Britain, even though they were being bombed and so on in the Second World War, they were growing 30% of their food in backyard gardens. I mean, we can produce an enormous amount of our food right in the cities and towns where we live. We can do things like grow sprouts, germinate seeds like sunflower seed, like Dr. Bricola has been great about explaining. Everyone can grow these things in our own home. We can all buy vegetables and ferment vegetables, and if you have fermented vegetables and sprouted seeds as the cornerstone of your diet, you can eat a pretty simple diet and still be extremely healthy. But we've got to start paying attention to what we're putting in our bodies, and we've got to realize that it's like no one's going to take care of us if we don't take care of ourselves and our families and our neighbors and our communities. We've got to take things in hand and, get back control of our health, but we're also going to have to rise up and get back control of our government, and decentralize this enormous power now that lies in the hands of the corporate mass media and the federal government and corporate America. We got to get this power, cut it down to size, and bring it back into our communities where things are more manageable.
Yeah. I would love to see a way that, since the federal government seems to be doing about 98% of its activities completely illegally now, it just seems like there should be a way to make use of that to get some of those things stopped.
I think there are, but I think it's a global question now at this point. It's like we need the help of the global grassroots in order to regain control in our individual, countries. Once everyone is rising up against big pharma and the big chemical companies and Monsanto and so on, it's going to make it easier for us in the U.S. To regain control. I know Monsanto is trying to merge now with Syngenta, which is another nasty genetic engineering and chemical company based in Switzerland, and they want to set up their new headquarters in the UK in Great Britain because they want to dodge taxes in the U.S. and because they know that we're about to catch up with them and put them on trial, for crimes against humanity. So if we're going to get Monsanto, cut down to size and permanently take away their ability to harm people and harm the planet, we're going to need the help of people all over the world. And when people in El Salvador, now they banned Roundup because it was killing so many farm workers, giving with severe kidney damage and liver damage. Well, they banned Monsanto's Roundup in El Salvador. They banned it, or in the process, in Sri Lanka because they were having a similar, problem. Even in Colombia, they forced the government to stop spraying Roundup from airplanes under the guise of this stupid war on drugs. Other countries are moving in that direction as well. It's a global struggle we're in now, and it's a battle for our literal survival. And so we thank goodness we have the ability to communicate with our counterparts all over the world. There is such a thing as a global grassroots, and that's one thing we have in common in probably all 200 countries in the world, is that no one is satisfied with their government. No one is satisfied with the behavior of these out-of-control corporations and financial institutions, and everyone, would just like to have a simple, normal, healthy life where ethics and, cooperation rather than greed and violence were the norm.
Yeah, I think it's a great description, and I think I was just looking at why, certain corporations that have nothing to do with the free market at all are, like you say, so out of control. And I think it's that the governments are funneling central bank assets to them with specific agendas in mind, so that they will be like part of an extension of governments themselves. And even though, like we talked about before, it's essential that the public's intelligence on these things and perception abilities get sharper and sharper, because every one of these points is very subtle. For example, international cooperation between people in all countries who basically all want the same thing is absolutely essential, and yet every one of those countries has to keep their own sovereignty intact against the attacks of the global corporations. And I think, it used to be, like in the beginning of this country, that the protective tariff system made sure that the industries didn't leave the country. It's not just that it's getting global competition now, it's that the laws have been changed to encourage that. And I think if every country, takes care of itself to the point that they don't lose their local economy and industries, and then they cooperate with each other and somehow stop the central banks from getting their money through the governments to these privileged corporations, that what you said could actually happen. Which I
think so. I think we saw it in Greece here the last few weeks where, can you imagine in the U.S. if people were going to the bank or going to the ATM machines to be able to get money for everyday survival, and they couldn't get it?
Well, I think that's in the plans for later on.
That's it. And the Greek people were brave enough to vote, in a referendum that, what? I don't care. We got to have a new system,
Right.
And unfortunately, the ruling party there, or the dominant party in the parliament, backed down. But right. Greece, what were they going to have to do? They were going to have to buck the international financial system and issue their own money.
Right.
They could have done that.
They were going to have to follow.
They could have done that, but they backed off because they. Because the leadership got scared. But I really was hoping that they would. I was really hoping that they would go forward and issue their own currency, and then everyone would have seen that, the emperor's got no clothes. If you stand up to them, there's going to be some pain, but the outcome is going to be better than, putting the chains back on, which is essentially what the government's now done.
Yeah, I don't think the Greek people backed down. It was the rulers got trapped, from what I heard, in a fairly small room with so-called authorities from the EU, and said, you're not leaving this room, and you're not leaving the EU, and are there any other questions? And they didn't have the power to do what Iceland apparently did, but that needs to happen everywhere.
Yeah, it's a shame more people don't understand that Iceland not only refused to pay this, usurious, debt to these international bankers, but they actually put the bankers in jail in Iceland. And I think we're going to have to, people justice is going to have to be pretty stern if we're going to change this whole system.
Well, if anybody but those bankers did what the bankers are doing, it would be a list of about 10 major capital crimes. And as soon as they get the government to bail out the banks, what they're really doing is transferring the debt that the bankers rack up to the people and make the leverage available to take over the country. Iceland apparently realized that. Yeah.
And even with our food and farming system, it comes down to this. We talk to farmers at times who say, you know what, I want to get out of this GMO treadmill, this GMO herbicide, pesticide treadmill. I want to do what's right. But when I go to my bank, to get my, credit extended to plant, if I tell them I'm going organic or I'm going to, I'm going to raise free-range chickens or whatever, the bankers will not give you money to do the right thing. They'll only give you money to plant the genetically engineered crops and to, contract to sell them to your local monopoly grain elevator, and
right.
It's so this banking system, we have got to completely overthrow this regime. And unfortunately, a lot of the public, again, like we talked about earlier, they're so bogged down in everyday life with matters of survival, or health problems or emotional problems that they have trouble taking the time to understand that the whole Federal Reserve System in the United States is a total scam.
Yeah.
And, but we got to keep educating, and part of our major change that's going to have to happen is the banking system. I mean, I don't understand why. We have a state in the U.S., North Dakota, that has a state bank, that has really different policies from banks that are controlled by the Federal Reserve System. It's good for the state of North Dakota. It makes it more responsive to the will of the people. And yet, why don't 50 states have, state banks? Well, I mean, we're going to get there, but we need to get there sooner rather than later.
Yes, and the other thing is there was a reason that the Constitution said that gold and silver have to be the money, because they can't be manipulated and they can't be used to control people. There's no inflation ever. So, I think that needs to come back too. And it's just going to be a question of, like you said, how soon can the people figure it out? So I think what I'd like to do, our 5 minutes is just about up here, but I want you to definitely, refer to any, sites or campaigns or anything that you want people to go to and read about and donate to or whatever, and then just leave people with kind of a concise final thought to keep with them that, that will allow them to make a contribution to what we're trying to accomplish here.
Well, everyone needs to look for alternative sources of information about whatever you're looking for. And you can find it on the internet. You can listen to community radio and search out, alternative newspapers and so on. It's like information is power, and we have got to arm ourselves with proper information. And we've got to associate ourselves with people who want change like ourselves. Our particular organization, organicconsumers.org. We have a massive website where we've archived, 150,000 articles over the last 18 years. We have a tremendous reservoir of information on everything relating to food and farming, and quite a bit on natural health and the environment and the climate crisis, politics. Use our search engine on the site. It's like a gigantic library. I've been building that library for 18 years, and I can vouch for the information on that site. But also we have links to other websites and Facebook pages off of organicconsumers.org where there's other valuable information. We have a couple million people in our network in the United States, Organic Consumers, but we're part of a much bigger movement now, and it's not Democrat, it's not Republican, it's not independent that matters. What matters is the truth, and we've got to get together. We're not, you're not going to find people very often who agree with you on 100% of the issues. That's not that important. We need to get together with the people who agree with us on the major issues that we're concerned about and work together. And forget about whether they go to church or don't go to church, or whether they voted for a Republican or a Democrat the last time, or the color of their skin or their age or whatever. what's important is that we deal with this crisis. It's bearing down on us more and more every day. We have got to rescue. The body politic has to rise to the occasion and take back our power. Literally, the fate of the earth depends on what we do here in the United States.
Yeah, I completely agree. It's really encouraging to hear that echoed so eloquently, and I really appreciate it. So hang on after we're done here for a minute. We'll say goodbye after at the break, and I hope that you'll come back more than once again as things continue to unfold. So thanks for your time to be here.
Okay, keep up the good work.
All right. So, well, that was a incredible interview with Ronnie Cummins, which I would really recommend everybody go to their site, get on their mailing list for their news updates. Great organization, as far as I can tell. They've been doing a lot of fantastic work.